Welcome back for a second episode of Growing Bok Choy from Seeds. It's day 11. There's the marine layer effect, May gray in effect. It's cold and cloudy for most of these mornings, and the sun doesn't come out until the afternoon. You can see a stunted seedling right there, and one seedling that's tipped over. I alluded to what I call potting mix syndrome in the first episode, whereby if you grow everything in pure potting mix, it has a tendency to not have proper root anchoring and everything just falls over, along with some other flaws. But in this case, I've mixed in a lot of wild clay dirt, and now I'm trying to pile on some support with some more dry dirt, but it's still slumping over, so I'm wondering what's going on. I'll do some further investigation. As you can see, the water tends to gather in a ring on the perimeter. That's because the high ground is in the center, which is actually good. You want plants maybe to grow on some sort of a slope if they're prone to root rot and whatnot. So there's drainage, but in a pot it's kind of limited as to what you can do in terms of terrain features. But luckily I seeded my plants mostly away from the perimeter. Maybe this one's a little closer. I wasn't that careful with the positioning of every single seed. So I'm using a squirt bottle to wash off the undersides of these leaves, although you can see the left one, first true leaf, is just wading in the mud. So it definitely has a fungal infection, and that root is all pinched. So I'll try to bury it deeper so it can remain upright. Maybe that's a mistake. Maybe it'll just rot and fester. And on day 15, we finally got one sunny morning. I haven't watered since that deeper transplant 4 days ago because you saw how soggy and waterlogged and mushy everything was. So despite having all this clay soil mixed in, it's still very prone to acting like potting mix. I would say the majority of what's in this pot is still potting mix. So that one's stunted yet still, and all these ones in the center are doing much better. Maybe I could have created a bigger artificial hill in the middle, but then that would have its own issues as well, affecting sunlight, and some of the seedlings on the outer perimeters would maybe just bend a little bit or be prone to falling over. I don't know. But so far everything's going pretty well, I would say, despite the lack of sunny mornings. So if the sun comes out at noon and beyond later in the day, it just doesn't do anything for my balcony plants because this is east facing. But as you can see, the true leaves are getting bigger, and somehow this infected seedling is carrying on, even though its root system got pinched like that. And this one is just small. So it's day 18. It's 3 days later, a week after I did the transplant in the same spot, of course. That one's still small, but it's grown a little bit. And this is definitely a little bit slower than I expected, although with all those May gray days in San Diego County, maybe it's not abnormal. I think these would require full sun to get to a harvest point in 30 days, and we're definitely not on track for that. As you can see, the seedling that's been transplanted deeper is sort of just carrying on like nothing happened, and that mud that dried out looks really unaesthetic. So it's just a reminder, don't overwater in the beginning. And you always have to pay attention and be mindful for the local climate conditions and temperatures and sunlight. Because if you just water like it's sunny every day when it's not, then you could run into real trouble and pretty soon lose a lot of these to root rot or pinching. So I did a little bit of watering. The perimeter was a little cracked and dry looking. As you can see, there's a puddle at the 9 o'clock position. So that's sort of where I depressed the ground a little bit by pressing on it and adding some clay dirt. It still wasn't enough to kind of fill that void. So it's day 22, And this is sort of a partial sun day. It's not full-on sun for the entire morning. So this balcony gets maybe 4.5 hours of direct sun in the morning. It's a lot less harsh than the western afternoon sun that my plants used to receive on the old apartment balcony. So I've been in this apartment for about a month, and prior to that all my plant growing series were done with west facing afternoon sun over a parking lot, so a lot of the heat from the afternoon sun would radiate from that parking lot and pretty much roast anything that hung over the railing of the balcony. Currently I do have my raspberry cutting that's going over the railing, but I'm facing a courtyard now, so it's a lot cooler, and there's lots of these giant birds of paradise and queen palms that suck up all the sun and heat in the courtyard. So the local microclimate conditions are quite different. So it's day 27. As you can see, there's been a lot more growth. The stems are thicker. They don't look as pale as they used to. And there's a honeybee just hanging out and sunning on one of my bok choy leaves. I don't know what else it may have been doing. It just seems to be sitting there basking in the morning sun and sort of sniffing around, not really doing anything. If I'm not mistaken, it seems almost like it's this bee alone that keeps visiting my raspberry cutting, but maybe I'm mistaken. All bees look alike, and they are sister clones after all, from the same queen or queens usually, so there's no way I could tell which one is which, but it seems like there's just always one honeybee buzzing around my new raspberry flowers. And I've also seen 2 hummingbirds as well. Maybe they're a pair. So the foliage looks a lot better now. The bok choy petioles and stalks, the stems, seem to be much juicier now, more characteristic of what I was expecting. And it's interesting how the cotyledons have all folded down. There was a point earlier in this video, well, I guess it still is, but they form X's. The first pairs of true leaves point up at a pretty acute angle, and the cotyledons just sort of fold down and get stuck in the mud. So that provides additional support, and it's way too much micromanagement to sort of bother with that. I think after many successive waterings and days of those cotyledons being folded down and stuck in the mud, they'll just sort of rot away, and they don't really matter at this point. They're obsolete. So as long as there's a lot of true leaf growth and more sets of true leaves coming out, then it seems like everything's going really well. And it seems like the leaves are a bit parched, despite the appearance of this little puddle passing us by right now. The ground is quite deficient in moisture because all the leaves are sort of droopy like that, or half droopy. And it's amazing how this one that had the fungal infection at the beginning of this episode has fully recovered, or it's just carried on like nothing ever happened. A small stunted plant has grown a little bit and carried on as well. So that's good to know. Seems like all of my plants have just soldiered on and kept growing and growing despite the wet waterlogged conditions of early May, and actually throughout almost all of May. So watch the leaves regain their turgor pressure on 6x video speed. It's quite amazing how fast this one responded. Maybe the fastest responding plant to watering from a dehydrated state in full sun that I've ever seen. Because in the past I think it would take maybe 20 or even up to 30 minutes sometimes for most of my vines and other plants to respond. I think the thick petioles and stems of this plant are where it stores a lot of water, and with all these overcrowded little seedlings growing exponentially faster and bigger, the water demand should really soar over time. And as you can see now on 6x fast forward, the leaves have regained all their turgor pressure over the course of what was about 7.5 minutes. So they're not all fully unwrinkled, but They mostly are, and that's quite amazing for such a short amount of time. But I'll have to be vigilant and start watering maybe every other day and more generously in the middle. I don't need to water on the perimeter really because that's where the low-lying soil is.